I have talked about the need for efficiencies, the need to make sure that you're not, haven't put your ARPA dollars entirely into your operating budget. We tried not to do that at the state level. We also have, tight budgets, and we'll continue to.
But here we are. What's interesting about this whole thing is we were having these crises, 2019. We're back to them a few years later because all the COVID windfall revenues are gone. And people hear it all the time. It's just more of the same, where the budget spending keeps going up and up and up, and taxpayers are forced to pay more and more and more.
Separately, that was Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and Wirepoints President Ted Dabrowski talking about the state's financial condition. Welcome back, Illinois in Focus Daily. I'm Greg Bishop, and yesterday we talked about this document from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, where it talks about how the state is expecting to have a $5 billion annual deficit by 2030. And it gives several recommendations on investing in education and economic development, and more spending here, more spending there, and maybe some efficiencies. But again, when you look at this document that comes from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, you can see all of the different spending levels and the resources that they're going to be collecting in taxation from 2025 through 2030. And you've got the overall spending expected to be upwards to $63 billion by 2030. Keep in mind, that's $10 billion more than what is being spent in the current fiscal year. Total expenditures in this current year, $53.2 billion. By 2030, they're estimating it's going to increase by $10 billion. It's $63 billion. Now, what about the deficits? The general fund surplus versus deficits? Well, next year we'll have a nearly $3 billion deficit, and it grows from there all the way up to $5 billion the last 3 years of this 5-year forecast, with the ongoing costs increasing. Education, human services, public safety, and so on. Now, Governor J.B. Pritzker last week, before this report came out from his Office of Management and Budget, he was asked about Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's dire straits for the city of Chicago just before Johnson gave his budget address, where he urged for a $300 million property tax increase. Well, Pritzker gave some of his budgeting philosophy when he was asked about the prospect of a property tax increase.
I have talked about the need for efficiencies, the need to make sure that you're not, haven't put your ARPA dollars entirely into your operating budget. And I don't know what the percentage is for the city rather, but it's a reasonably high percentage. And so that obviously causes problems. We tried not to do that at the state level. We also have, tight budgets, and we'll continue to.
So the governor went on to talk about how difficult it was to budget heading into the COVID-19 pandemic.
Just to go back to a day when it was really hard during my term in office, was when the pandemic hit, and we were in the spring of 2020 and putting forward our FY21 budget. We had a budget, we passed, and then going into FY21, it seemed clear that we need to make cuts at that point because revenues were falling off a cliff, and we didn't have what ended up being the American Rescue Plan Act. And so we found $700 million of cuts to make it. I mean, that is not easy. I'm not suggesting anybody wants to do that, but we did it. We did it without laying people off. But we did it, and I know I don't want to see anybody laid off. There are lots of solutions to these problems that need to be brought to the fore.
So again, the governor talking about how they were heading into the COVID pandemic, saw the revenues were dropping off, and then it was before they had the American Rescue Plan Act. Federal tax funds, your tax dollars going to Congress in Washington, D.C., coming back to states. Illinois took in $33.3 billion, according to federal pandemic oversight operations. I believe it's pandemicoversight.gov. You can go in and look at Illinois and how much they got. It's $33.3 billion. And what's been fascinating about this is the governor and even the comptroller have pushed back on the idea that Illinois' finances were only good because of the COVID money that was received by the federal government. And Republicans, for the past several years, talking about the budget, the increase in spending, because it has increased in spending for every year that Pritzker's been in office. They talk about the COVID dollars drying up, and we really shouldn't have these increased spending habits if the COVID dollars are going to dry up soon. And then you had all the conversation about non-citizen migrants getting more than $1 billion in housing, food, legal assistance, and even taxpayer-subsidized health insurance for non-citizen migrants in the state of Illinois. Again, $1 billion plus, if not even more, especially as the problem continues. And the crisis continues with tens of thousands of non-citizen migrants in the state of Illinois alone. But regardless, the governor and other leading Democrats would push back on Republicans and saying, no, COVID dollars had nothing to do with our fiscal prowess. Well, here we are now looking at, again, the governor's Office of Management and Budget saying, hey, over the next 5 years, we are going to have billions in deficits. And the total coming up to around, $22.2 billion worth of deficits in all 5 years combined. I connected with Wirepoints President Ted Dabrowski. He analyzes these numbers, and he got his hands on this report that was released late Friday and shared some of his initial thoughts.
Well, we got a big surprise the other day from Governor Pritzker and his OMB, his Office of Management and Budget team. Surprise! They're saying they're going to have a $3 billion deficit next year, a $4 billion plus deficit the following year, and then $5 billion deficits the 3 years after that. And it was quite shocking to me for a governor that's been very emphatic about the job he's done at the state level, on the balanced budgets, on the improvement in credit ratings, to where we today have an economy that's, let's say, much more functional than it was during COVID, and interest rates are going down. So big surprise, and I'm not sure what that means. I'm not sure if that's a signal that we need massive tax hikes again, or whether we're going to have to see massive cuts because people can't put up with it anymore.
So in talking with Ted, again, this is a conversation I had with him yesterday. We looked at some of the spending, and the increased spending is across the board when it comes to education, when it comes to public safety. Human services sees a pretty substantial increase and the amount of spending for taxpayers. And again, just to look at this, let's go to human services. 11.5 billion this year, 12 billion the next year, 12.5, 13 billion, 13.5 billion, 14.1 billion. You've got healthcare increasing from 8.9 billion to 11.5 billion. Government services altogether, that's increasing from 4.8 to 5.7. So increased spending, including education, 13.5 up to 15.8. The spending continues. More from Debrowski.
It is phenomenal. First, you have to understand that the budget today is huge compared to what it was before COVID. We had a $40 billion budget right before COVID. It's at $53 billion the current year, so that's already a massive increase. You're talking about $13 billion more dollars. Where did the money go? And we know where a lot of it went, but suddenly we're back into deficits again. And they want to take that $53 billion spending and make it $63 billion by 2030. So you're talking about, again, more and more. They call it investments. I call it, massive waste of spending in education. Not because education isn't worthy of spending, it's because it does nothing for results. We can talk about that briefly. Massive increases in human services, of course, more to pensions, and it just doesn't seem to stop. And I think, the bottom line is Governor Pritzker took, and of course the legislature took, all that COVID windfall tax revenues, and they've just shoved it into programmatic spending, and it won't stop now. And they have no way to stop it. So spending goes up over the next 5 years by 10 billion, whereas revenues only go up by 5. And that's how you end up with all these $5 billion deficits each year.
And we also reviewed some of the policy objectives that are in this GOMB budget, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. And it talks about increased spending for education, investments, they call it, saving for the future in the Budget Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund, increasing that spending as well. They say that they want to aim at reducing debt obligations and saving on interest costs. They also outline how they want to continue the reduction of unpaid bills and spending on that. Economic development investments, spending on that type of thing, like having a closing fund, for instance, the governor controls to bring businesses to Illinois, and then also spending controls. Here they talk about the governor implementing spending controls in a number of areas with new efficiencies and believes the people of Illinois expect high-quality programs and services, as well as the most efficient and effective use of their tax dollars. So clearly, some policy objectives that Gombe puts out there, but Debrowski says it's really not going to do much.
I don't, and I'll tell you why, because this is just, again, and people hear it all the time, it's just more of the same, where the budget spending keeps going up and up and up, and taxpayers are forced to pay more and more and more. We've seen it through property taxes. We've seen it through all kinds of taxes and fees. And, you can see the outmigration as a result of that, at least, contributes to that. What I do think the big takeaway, I think, will be is that Governor Pritzker will say, look, we need to spend $63 billion. He's going to say that. And either we raise taxes to do it. We're $5 billion short in those last 3 years, $5 billion short a year. Or we're going to have to do massive cuts, and he's going to threaten about the cuts like we always hear. We're going to have to cut education. We have to cut football and band and music. We'll hear stuff like that, and it's going to hurt people. But I think the real story is that we keep hurting people with these tax hikes and service cuts that we've seen already. So I think it's just going to be a big warning, like we saw before. We saw that when the progressive tax failed. He warned that he's going to have to slash things, and COVID came along and changed that whole dynamic. But here we are. What's interesting about this whole thing is we were having these crises, 2019. We're back to them a few years later because all the COVID windfall revenues are gone.
And again, in talking with Debrowski, it was yesterday, and we kind of looked at what's happening today. Today, you've got 3 non-binding questions Illinois voters are going to sound off on. One of them says, hey, we're going to propose to you a 3% surcharge on millionaires to fund property tax relief. But will voters know about the state's finances before they go into the polls?
Yeah, so it's a non-binding referendum, so maybe fewer people will know about it. But the people who do, it'll be curious. They won't know about this stuff that we're talking about. It came out, just Friday night. So, and of course, all the people that early voted had no chance to even consider it. But I have to wonder, that 2020 progressive tax failed. It should have passed because, Governor Pritzker promised 97% of Illinoisans a small tax cut, and he would go after the 3% richest. And it's funny because that should have passed like with a slam dunk, and it didn't. People rejected it. So people are very distrustful of, I think, the taxing policy of our state. Let's see what happens tomorrow. Maybe the fact that it's non-binding carries a little less weight, but let's see if people are skeptical again, as they should be.
Obviously, the state's finances could play a lot into that, but we've also heard that this non-binding question could turn into a proposed constitutional amendment in 2 years. What are the prospects of the state's finances playing a role into that, looking into the future?
I mean, here, what they're going to do is, politicians and Governor Pritzker will look at the results of the referendum and see, what they're trying to do is, that referendum is again questioned very well. We'll tax the rich so that we can give everybody else property tax relief. Again, the way that's worded, it's tricky because you don't really know if they'll ever give property tax relief, but it's worded in a way to get the voters to come out and vote for it. We'll see if it's rejected again. That's egg on his face, and if it's not rejected, they're going to try to use that as there's a sweetener, and they're a really good sweetener because people are fed up with property taxes, of course.
And some final words from Ted Dabrowski, president of Wirepoints, in the conversation I had with him yesterday.
No, the only thing I'd add to that is that this whole tax increase in progressive tax and millionaires tax kind of just really goes counter to the most recent data we saw that 93,000 people left the state on net last year due to all kinds of reasons, and so more tax hikes can't be anything but a people chaser.
Again, thanks to Ted Dabrowski for letting me chat with him yesterday. We also talked more about the tax competitiveness issue. May air that a little bit later on, looking at the Tax Foundation's recent reports on Illinois. It is Illinois in Focus Daily, every morning with you. Wake up, be sure to get the subscription with America's Talking Network here on YouTube, get the podcast anywhere you get podcasts, and get the headlines at thecentersquare.com.